All right, so if you haven't started watercoloring or watercolor takes you forever, this is your alternate method, where I just did a whole layer over everything, really light in value. I have my masking fluid on here to block out like the highlights. And then I added a little bit extra pigment and technique in the negative space. So I used salt and I just used a tiny bit. So the less salt you use, the more you're gonna get like these bigger areas where it's like soaking up the water. So if you don't like the way your salt turns out, it could be that you're using too much of it. Okay, then I'm actually gonna leave my masking fluid on simply because like this little highlight on the finger is really close to the core shadow. But if your highlights are really far away from your dark values, then you could peel off. Like for me, this is like where some light values are. So you're gonna kind of, and I would make sure your hands are clean, otherwise you're gonna get your watercolor paper dirty. So you kind of get one side lifted, and then you can peel off. Okay, but I don't want all these little rubbery balls everywhere, so make a little pile. And then they go in the garbage because then these get stuck on your shoes, they get stuck on the chairs, it gets tracked into the carpet. So be careful with all your little pieces. Kramer's baking. Sure, thanks. All right, Mariana, you're leaving and you're in my video. All right, so you still need range of value. So some of that range of value is going to happen with mark making, but most of it would come from adding a second layer of watercolor. So instead of starting with the dark values, you would end with dark values. So I'm going to add my core shadow and then show you guys how to fade in. So with this method, you do have to be a little bit careful because you don't want like a lot of disturbance with the watercolor paper, meaning I'm not going over that area like again and again and again. Let me test out what color. Okay. Go a little bit darker. So I have my core shadow along this edge. It kind of curves in. And it comes in this way. Then immediately I'm gonna get water on my brush, wipe it off on the newspaper a little bit. And this is where like my midtones are that I've outlined. So I'm gonna fade it. And since I have a ton of analogous color happening with my first layer, I wouldn't be so concerned about adding analogous color, but while it's wet, I'm gonna touch a little bit of an analogous color. And then I can plop some water on there, like tap, tap, tap. So it's wet on wet. And it should stay a little bit. And then I just wouldn't touch that. But I would make sure where I have this line of watercolor, I'm gonna fade that in a little bit more, so that it's still gonna slowly transition into what I have. And it's not gonna actually look that much like a second layer, but I'm using another dark value layer to build up my contrast. So this is the alternate method, especially if you haven't started watercoloring. Well, maybe this is the method you do because you're supposed to be done watercoloring at this point. And then if you need help or you're not quite sure what technique or what colors to use, then ask. And then I personally, if your highlights are really close to the darkest values, leave the masking fluid on. But having said that, you don't want masking fluid to sit on your project for a long time. It becomes stuck. Like about a week or so is all that you want the masking fluid on there. And then it starts pulling up pieces of paper, like it can kind of ruin the paper a little bit. So it's like a temporary thing on your paper.